The Lives of Eminent Philosophers. By Diogenes Laertius. Book 8, The Pythagoreans. Pythagoras. 1. Having now completed our account of the philosophy of Ionia, starting with Thales, as well as of its chief representatives, let us proceed to examine the philosophy of Italy, which was started by Pythagoras, son of the gem engraver Nizacus, and according to Hermippus, a Samian, or, according to Aristoxenus, a Tyrrhenian from one of those islands which the Athenians held after clearing them of their Tyrrhenian inhabitants. Some indeed say that he was descended through Euthyphro, Hippasus and Marmachus from Cleonymus, who was exiled from Phlius, and that, as Marmachus lived in Samos, so Pythagoras was called a Samian. 2. From Samos he went, it is said, to Lesbos with an introduction to phases from his uncles Oilus. He had 3 silver flagons made and took them as presents to each of the priests of Egypt. He had brothers, of whom Animus was the elder and Tyrrhenus the second. He also had a slave, Zamolxis, who is worshipped, so says Herodotus, by the Getans, as Cronos. He was a pupil, as already stated, of Phasads of Syros, after whose death he went to Samos to be the pupil of Hermodamas, Creophilus's descendant, a man already advanced in years. While still young, so eager was he for knowledge, he left his own country and had himself initiated into all the mysteries and rites not only of Greece but also of foreign countries. 3. Now he was in Egypt when Polycrates sent him a letter of introduction to Amasis. He learnt the Egyptian language, so we learn from Antiphon in his book on men of outstanding merit, and he also journeyed among the Chaldeans and Magi. Then while in Crete he went down into the cave of Ida with Epaminondas. He also entered the Egyptian sanctuaries, and was told their secret lore concerning the gods. After that he returned to Samos to find his country under the tyranny of Polycrates, so he sailed away to Croton in Italy, and there he laid down a constitution for the Italian Greeks, and he and his followers were held in great estimation, for, being nearly 300 in number, so well did they govern the state that its constitution was in effect a true aristocracy, government by the best. 4. This is what Heraclides of Pontus tells us he used to say about himself, that he had once been Athalides and was accounted to be Hermes' son, and Hermes told him he might choose any gift he liked except immortality, so he asked to retain through life and through death a memory of his experiences. Hence in life he could recall everything, and when he died he still kept the same memories. Afterwards in course of time his soul entered into Euphorbus and he was wounded by Menelaus. Now Euphorbus used to say that he had once been Athalides and obtained this gift from Hermes, and then he told of the wanderings of his soul, how it migrated hither and thither, into how many plants and animals it had come, and all that it underwent in Hades, and all that the other souls there have to endure. 5. When Euphorbus died, his soul passed into Hermodamas, and he also, wishing to authenticate the story, went up to the temple of Apollo at Branchidae, where he identified the shield which Menelaus, on his voyage home from Troy, had dedicated to Apollo, so he said, the shield being now so rotten through and through that the ivory facing only was left. When Hermodamas died, he became pious, a fisherman of Delos, and again he remembered everything, how he was first Athalides, then Euphorbus, then Hermodamas, and then Pius. But when Pius died, he became Pythagoras, and still remembered all the facts mentioned. 6. There are some who insist, absurdly enough, that Pythagoras left no writings whatever. At all events Heraclitus, the physicist, almost shouts in our ear, Pythagoras, son of Nizacus, practiced inquiry beyond all other men, and in this selection of his writings made himself a wisdom of his own, showing much learning but poor workmanship. The occasion of this remark was the opening words of Pythagoras's treatise on nature, namely, "Nay, I swear by the air I breathe, I swear by the water I drink, I will never suffer censure on account of this work." Pythagoras in fact wrote 3 books: on education, on statesmanship, and on nature. 7. But the book which passes as the work of Pythagoras is by Lysis of Tarentum, a Pythagorean, who fled to Thebes and taught Epaminondas. Heraclides, the son of Serapion, in his Epitome of Sotion, says that he also wrote a poem on the universe, and secondly the sacred poem which begins, "Young men, come reverence in quietude all these my words," thirdly on the soul, fourthly of piety, fifthly Helothales the father of Epicharmus of Kos, sixthly Croton, and other works as well. The same authority says that the poem on the mysteries was written by Hippasus to defame Pythagoras, and that many others written by Aston of Croton were ascribed to Pythagoras. 8. Aristoxenus says that Pythagoras got most of his moral doctrines from the Delphic priestess Themistocles. According to Ion of Chios in his Tragme, he ascribed some poems of his own making to Orpheus. They further attribute to him the Scopiads, which begins thus, "Be not shameless, before any man." Socrates in his Successions of Philosophers says that, when Leon the tyrant of Phlius asked him who he was, he said, "A philosopher," and that he compared life to the great games, where some went to compete for the prize and others went with wares to sell, but the best as spectators, for similarly, in life, some grow up with servile natures, greedy for fame and gain, but the philosopher seeks for truth. Thus much for this part of the subject. 9. The contents in general of the aforesaid 3 treatises of Pythagoras are as follows. He forbids us to pray for ourselves, because we do not know what will help us. Drinking he calls, in a word, a snare, and he discountenances all excess, saying that no one should go beyond due proportion, either in drinking or in eating. Of sexual indulgence, too, he says, keep to the winter for sexual pleasures, in summer abstain, they are less harmful in autumn and spring, but they are always harmful and not conducive to health. Asked once when a man should consort with a woman, he replied, when you want to lose what strength you have. 10. He divides man's life into 4 quarters thus, 20 years a boy, 20 years a youth, 20 years a young man, 20 years an old man, and these 4 periods correspond to the 4 seasons, the boy to spring, the youth to summer, the young man to autumn, and the old man to winter, meaning by youth one not yet grown up and by a young man a man of mature age. According to Timaeus, he was the first to say, friends have all things in common and friendship is equality. Indeed, his disciples did put all their possessions into one common stock. For 5 whole years they had to keep silence, merely listening to his discourses without seeing him, until they passed an examination, and thenceforward they were admitted to his house and allowed to see him. They would never use coffins of cypress, because the scepter of Zeus was made from it. So we are informed by Hermippus in his 2nd book on Pythagoras. 11. Indeed, his bearing is said to have been most dignified, and his disciples held the opinion about him that he was Apollo come down from the far north. There is a story that once, when he was disrobed, his thigh was seen to be of gold, and when he crossed the river Nessus, quite a number of people said they heard it welcome him. According to Timaeus in the 10th book of his history, he remarked that the consorts of men bore divine names, being called first virgins, then brides, and then mothers. He it was who brought geometry to perfection, while it was Meros who first discovered the beginnings of the elements of geometry, and Heraclides in his 2nd book on Alexander affirms this. 12. And further that Pythagoras spent most of his time upon the arithmetical aspect of geometry. He also discovered the musical intervals on the monochord. Nor did he neglect even medicine. We are told by Apollodorus the calculator that he offered a sacrifice of oxen on finding that in a right-angled triangle the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the squares on the sides containing the right angle. And there is an epigram running as follows. What time Pythagoras that famed figure found, for which the noble offering he brought. He is also said to have been the first to diet athletes on meat, trying first with urines, so we learn from Pythagoreans in the third book of his Memorabilia, whereas in former times they had trained on dried figs, on butter, and even on wheat meal, as we are told by the same Pythagoreans in the 8th book of his Miscellaneous History. 13. Some say it was a certain trainer named Pythagoras who instituted this diet, and not our Pythagoras, who forbade even the killing, let alone the eating, of animals which share with us the privilege of having a soul. This was the excuse put forward, but his real reason for forbidding animal diet was to practice people and accustom them to simplicity of life, so that they could live on things easily procurable, spreading their tables with uncooked foods and drinking pure water only, for this was the way to a healthy body and a keen mind. Of course the only altar at which he worshipped was that of Apollo the giver of life, behind the altar of horns at Delos, for thereon were placed flour and meal and cakes, without the use of fire, and there was no animal victim, as we are told by Aristotle in his Constitution of Delos. 14. He was the first, they say, to declare that the soul, bound now in this creature, now in that, thus goes on around ordained of necessity. He too, according to Aristophanes the musician, was the first to introduce weights and measures into Greece. It was he who first declared that the evening and morning stars are the same, as Parmenides maintains. So greatly was he admired that his disciples used to be called prophets to declare the voice of God, besides which he himself says in a written work that after 207 years in Hades he has returned to the land of the living. Thus it was that they remained his staunch adherents, and men came to hear his words from afar, among them Lucanians, Pusetians, Messapians and Romans. 15. Down to the time of Philolaus it was not possible to acquire knowledge of any Pythagorean doctrine, and Philolaus alone brought out those 3 celebrated books which Plato sent 100 minas to purchase. Not less than 600 persons went to his evening lectures, and those who were privileged to see him wrote to their friends congratulating themselves on a great piece of good fortune. Moreover, the Metapontines named his house the Temple of Demeter and his porch the Museum, so we learn from Pythagoreans in his Miscellaneous History. And the rest of the Pythagoreans used to say that not all his doctrines were for all men to hear, our authority for this being Aristophanes in the 10th book of his Rules of Pedagogy, 16. Where we are also told that one of the school, Xenophilus by name, asked by someone how he could best educate his son, replied, by making him the citizen of a well-governed state. Throughout Italy Pythagoras made many into good men and true, men too of note like the lawgivers Zaleucus and Charondas, for he had a great gift for friendship, and especially, when he found his own watchwords adopted by anyone, he would immediately take to that man and make a friend of him. 17. The following were his watchwords or precepts: don't stir the fire with a knife, don't step over the beam of a balance, don't sit down on your bushel, don't eat your heart, don't help a man off with a load but help him on, always roll your bedclothes up, don't put God's image on the circle of a ring, don't leave the pan's imprint on the ashes, don't wipe up a mess with a torch, don't commit a nuisance towards the sun, don't walk the highway, don't shake hands too eagerly, don't have swallows under your own roof, don't keep birds with hooked claws, don't make water on nor stand upon your nail and hair trimmings, turn the sharp blade away, when you go abroad don't turn round at the frontier. 18. This is what they meant. Don't stir the fire with a knife, don't stir the passions or the swelling pride of the great. Don't step over the beam of a balance, don't overstep the bounds of equity and justice. Don't sit down on your bushel. Have the same care of today and the future, a bushel being the day's ration. By not eating your heart he meant not wasting your life in troubles and pains. By saying do not turn round when you go abroad, he meant to advise those who are departing this life not to set their heart's desire on living nor to be too much attracted by the pleasures of this life. The explanations of the rest are similar and would take too long to set out. 19. Above all, he forbade as food red mullet and blacktail, and he enjoined abstinence from the hearts of animals and from beans, and sometimes, according to Aristotle, even from paunch and gunnered. Some say that he contented himself with just some honey or a honeycomb or bread, never touching wine in the daytime, and with greens boiled or raw for dainties, and fish but rarely. His robe was white and spotless, his quilts of white wool, for linen had not yet reached those parts. 20. He was never known to overeat, to behave loosely, or to be drunk. He would avoid laughter and all pandering to tastes such as insulting jests and vulgar tales. He would punish neither slave nor free man in anger. Admonition he used to call setting right. He used to practice divination by sounds or voices and by auguries, never by burnt offerings, beyond frankincense. The offerings he made were always inanimate, though some say that he would offer cocks, sucking goats and porkers, as they are called, but lambs never. However, Aristoxenus has it that he consented to the eating of all other animals, and only abstained from ploughing oxen and rams. 21. The same authority, as we have seen, asserts that Pythagoras took his doctrines from the Delphic priestess Themistocles. Hieronymus, however, says that, when he had descended into Hades, he saw the soul of Hesiod bound fast to a brazen pillar and regibbering, and the soul of Homer hung on a tree with serpents writhing about it, this being their punishment for what they had said about the gods. He also saw under torture those who would not remain faithful to their wives. This, says our authority, is why he was honored by the people of Croton. Aristippus of Cyrene affirms in his work on the physicists that he was named Pythagoras because he uttered the truth as infallibly as did the Pythian oracle. 22. He is said to have advised his disciples as follows, always to say on entering their own doors, "Where did I trespass? What did I achieve? And unfulfilled what duties did I leave? Not to let victims be brought for sacrifice to the gods, and to worship only at the altar unstained with blood. Not to call the gods to witness, man's duty being rather to strive to make his own word carry conviction. To honor their elders, on the principle that precedence in time gives a greater title to respect, for as in the world sunrise comes before sunset, so in human life the beginning before the end, and in all organic life birth precedes death. 23. And he further bade them to honor gods before demigods, heroes before men, and first among men their parents, and so to behave one to another as not to make friends into enemies, but to turn enemies into friends. To deem nothing their own. To support the law, to wage war on lawlessness. Never to kill or injure trees that are not wild, nor even any animal that does not injure man. That it is seemly and advisable neither to give way to unbridled laughter nor to wear sullen looks. To avoid excess of flesh, on a journey to let exertion and slackening alternate, to train the memory, in wrath to restrain hand and tongue. 24. To respect all divination, to sing to the lyre and by hymns to show due gratitude to gods and to good men. To abstain from binns because they are flatulent and partake most of the breath of life, and besides, it is better for the stomach if they are not taken, and this again will make our dreams in sleep smooth and untroubled. Alexander in his Successions of Philosophers says that he found in the Pythagorean memoirs the following tenets as well. 25. The principle of all things is the monad or unit, arising from this monad the undefined dyad or two serves as material substratum to the monad, which is cause. From the monad and the undefined dyad spring numbers, from numbers, points, from points, lines, from lines, plane figures, from plane figures, solid figures, from solid figures, sensible bodies, the elements of which are four: fire, water, earth and air. These elements interchange and turn into one another completely, and combine to produce a universe animate, intelligent, spherical, with the earth at its center, the earth itself too being spherical and inhabited round about. There are also antipodes, and our down is their up. 26. Light and darkness have equal part in the universe, so have hot and cold, and dry and moist, and of these, if hot preponderates, we have summer, if cold, winter, if dry, spring, if moist, late autumn. If all are in equilibrium, we have the best periods of the year, of which the freshness of spring constitutes the healthy season, and the decay of late autumn the unhealthy. So too, in the day, freshness belongs to the morning, and decay to the evening, which is therefore more unhealthy. The air about the earth is stagnant and unwholesome, and all within it is mortal, but the uppermost air is ever moved and pure and healthy, and all within it is immortal and consequently divine. 27. The sun, the moon, and the other stars are gods, for, in them, there is a preponderance of heat, and heat is the cause of life. The moon is illumined by the sun. Gods and men are akin, inasmuch as man partakes of heat, therefore God takes thought for man. Fate is the cause of things being thus ordered both as a whole and separately. The sun's ray penetrates through the ether, whether cold or dense, the air they call cold ether, and the sea and moisture dense ether, and this ray descends even to the depths and for this reason quickens all things. 28. All things live which partake of heat, this is why plants are living things, but all have not soul, which is a detached part of ether, partly the hot and partly the cold, for it partakes of cold ether too. Soul is distinct from life, it is immortal, since that from which it is detached is immortal. Living creatures are reproduced from one another by germination, there is no such thing as spontaneous generation from earth. The germ is a clot of brain containing hot vapor within it, and this, when brought to the womb, throws out, from the brain, ichor, fluid and blood, whence are formed flesh, sinews, bones, hairs, and the whole of the body, while soul and sense come from the vapor within. 29. First congealing in about 40 days, it receives form and, according to the ratios of harmony, in 7, 9, or at the most 10 months, the mature child is brought forth. It has in it all the relations constituting life, and these, forming a continuous series, keep it together according to the ratios of harmony, each appearing at regulated intervals. Sense generally, and sight in particular, is a certain unusually hot vapor. This is why it is said to see through air and water, because the hot ether is resisted by the cold, for, if the vapor in the A's had been cold, it would have been dissipated on meeting the air, its like. As it is, in certain lines, he calls the eyes the portals of the sun. His conclusion is the same with regard to hearing and the other senses. 30. The soul of man, he says, is divided into 3 parts, intelligence, reason, and passion. Intelligence and passion are possessed by other animals as well, but reason by man alone. The seat of the soul extends from the heart to the brain, the part of it which is in the heart is passion, while the parts located in the brain are reason and intelligence. The senses are distillations from these. Reason is immortal, all else mortal. The soul draws nourishment from the blood, the faculties of the soul are winds, for they as well as the soul are invisible, just as the ether is invisible. 31. The veins, arteries, and sinews are the bonds of the soul. But when it is strong and settled down into itself, reasonings and deeds become its bonds. When cast out upon the earth, it wanders in the air like the body. Hermes is the steward of souls, and for that reason is called Hermes the escorter, Hermes the keeper of the gate, and Hermes of the underworld, since it is he who brings in the souls from their bodies both by land and sea, and the pure are taken into the uppermost region, but the impure are not permitted to approach the pure or each other, but are bound by the Furies in bonds unbreakable. 32. The whole air is full of souls which are called genii or heroes, these are they who send men dreams and signs of future disease and health, and not to men alone, but to sheep also and cattle as well, and it is to them that purifications and lustrations, all divination, omens and the like, have reference. The most momentous thing in human life is the art of winning the soul to good or to evil. Blessed are the men who acquire a good soul, they can never be at rest, nor ever keep the same course 2 days together. 33. Right has the force of an oath, and that his wise use is called the god of oaths. Virtue is harmony, and so are health and all good and God himself. This is why they say that all things are constructed according to the laws of harmony. The love of friends is just concord and equality. We should not pay equal worship to gods and heroes, but to the gods always, with reverent silence, in white robes, and after purification, to the heroes only from midday onwards. Purification is by cleansing, baptism and lustration, and by keeping clean from all deaths and births and all pollution, and abstaining from meat and flesh of animals that have died, mullets, gunnards, eggs and egg-sprung animals, beans, and the other abstinences prescribed by those who perform mystic rites in the temples. 34. According to Aristotle in his work on the Pythagoreans, Pythagoras counseled abstinence from beans either because they are like the genitals, or because they are like the gates of Hades. As being alone unjointed, or because they are injurious, or because they are like the form of the universe, or because they belong to an oligarchy, since they are used in election by lot. He bade his disciples not to pick up fallen crumbs, either in order to accustom them not to eat immoderately, or because connected with a person's death, nay, even, according to Aristophanes, crumbs belong to the heroes, for in his Heroes he says, "Nor taste ye of what falls beneath the board." Another of his precepts was not to eat white cocks, as being sacred to the month and wearing suppliant garb, now supplication ranked with things good, sacred to the month because they announce the time of day, and again white represents the nature of the good, black the nature of evil. Not to touch such fish as were sacred, for it is not right that gods and men should be allotted the same things, any more than free men and slaves. 35. Not to break bread, for one's friends used to meet over one loaf, as the barbarians do even to this day, and you should not divide bread which brings them together. Some give as the explanation of this that it has reference to the judgment of the dead in Hades, others that bread makes cowards in war, others again that it is from it that the whole world begins. He held that the most beautiful figure is the sphere among solids, and the circle among plane figures. Old age may be compared to everything that is decreasing, while youth is one with increase. Health means retention of the form, disease its destruction. Of salt he said it should be brought to table to remind us of what is right, for salt preserves whatever it finds, and it arises from the purest sources, sun and sea. 36. This is what Alexander says that he found in the Pythagorean memoirs. What follows is Aristotle's. But Pythagoras' great dignity not even Timon overlooked, who, although he digs at him in his silly, speaks of Pythagoras, inclined to witching works and ways, mansnera, fond of noble paraphrase. Xenophanes confirms the statement about his having been different people at different times in the elegiac's beginning. Now other thoughts, another path, I show. What he says of him is as follows: they say that, passing a belabored whelp, he, full of pity, spake these words of dole, "Stay, smite not. 'Tis a friend, a human soul, I knew him straight when as I heard him yelp." 37. Thus Xenophanes. But Cratinus also lampooned him both in the Pythagorizing Woman and also in the Tarentines, where we read, "They are wont, if haply they a foreigner do find, to hold a cross-examination of doctrine's worth, to trouble and confound him with terms, equations, and antitheses brain-bunged with magnitudes and periphrases." Again, Nisimachus in the Alcmaeon, "To Loxias we sacrifice, Pythagoras his right, of nothing that is animate we ever take a bite." 38. And Aristophane in the Pythagorist, A. He told how he traveled in Hades and looked on the dwellers below, how each of them lives, but how different by far from the lives of the dead were the lives of the Pythagoreans, for these alone, so he said, were suffered to dine with King Pluto, which was for their piety's sake. B. What an ill-tempered god for whom such swine, such creatures good company make, and in the same later, their food is just greens, and to wet it pure water is all that they drink, and the want of a bath, and the vermin, and their old threadbare coats so do stink that none of the rest will come near them. 39. Pythagoras met his death in this wise. As he sat one day among his acquaintances at the house of Milo, it chanced that the house was set ablaze out of jealousy by one of the people who were not accounted worthy of admittance to his presence, though some say it was the work of the inhabitants of Croton anxious to safeguard themselves against the setting up of a tyranny. Pythagoras was caught as he tried to escape. He got as far as a certain field of beans, where he stopped, saying he would be captured rather than cross it, and be killed rather than prate about his doctrines, and so his pursuers cut his throat. So also were murdered more than half of his disciples, to the number of 40 or thereabouts, but a very few escaped, including Archippus of Tarentum and Lysis, already mentioned. 40. Diogenes, however, says that Pythagoras died a fugitive in the temple of the Muses at Metapontum after 40 days' starvation. Heraclides, in his epitome of the lives of Cyrus, says that, after burying Phasads at Delos, he returned to Italy and, when he found Cylon of Croton giving a luxurious banquet to all and sundry, retired to Metapontum to end his days there by starvation, having no wish to live longer. On the other hand, Hermippus relates that, when the men of Agrigentum and Syracuse were at war, Pythagoras and his disciples went out and fought in the van of the army of the Agrigentines, and, their line being turned, he was killed by the Syracusans as he was trying to avoid the beanfield. The rest, about 35 in number, were burned at the stake in Tarentum for trying to set up a government in opposition to those in power. 41. Hermippus gives another anecdote. Pythagoras, on coming to Italy, made a subterranean dwelling and enjoined on his mother to mark and record all that passed, and at what hour, and to send her notes down to him until he should assent. She did so. Pythagoras some time afterwards came up withered and looking like a skeleton, then went into the assembly and declared he had been down to Hades, and even read out his experiences to them. They were so affected that they wept and wailed and looked upon him as divine, going so far as to send their wives to him in hopes that they would learn some of his doctrines, and so they were called Pythagorean women. Thus far Hermippus. 42. Pythagoras had a wife, Theno by name, daughter of Brontinus of Croton, though some call her Brontinus's wife and Pythagoras's pupil. He had a daughter Damo, according to the letter of Lysis to Hippasus, which says of him, I am told by many that you discourse publicly, a thing which Pythagoras deemed unworthy, for certain it is that, when he entrusted his daughter Damo with the custody of his memoirs, he solemnly charged her never to give them to anyone outside his house. And, although she could have sold the writings for a large sum of money, she would not, but reckoned poverty and her father's solemn injunctions more precious than gold, for all that she was a woman. 43. They also had a son Telauges, who succeeded his father and, according to some, was Empedocles' instructor. At all events Hippolytus makes Empedocles say, Telauges, famed son of Theno and Pythagoras. Telauges wrote nothing, so far as we know, but his mother Theno wrote a few things. Further, a story is told that being asked how many days it was before a woman becomes pure after intercourse, she replied, with her own husband at once, with another man never. And she advised a woman going into her own husband to put off her shame with her clothes, and on leaving him to put it on again along with them. Asked put on what? She replied, what makes me to be called a woman? 44. To return to Pythagoras. According to Heraclides, the son of Serapion. He was 80 years old when he died, and this agrees with his own description of the life of man, though most authorities say he was 90. And there are jesting lines of my own upon him as follows: Not thou alone from all things animate didst keep, Pythagoras. All food is dead when boiled and baked and salt besprinkled for then it surely is inanimate. Again, so wise was wise Pythagoras that he would touch no meats, but called it impious, bade others eat. Good wisdom, not for us to do the wrong, let others impious be. 45. And again, if thou wouldst know the mind of old Pythagoras, look on a Phoebus buckler and its boss. He says I've lived before. If, when he says he was not. He was no one when he was. And again, of the manner of his death, woe. Woe. Whence, Pythagoras, this deep reverence for bins? Why did he fall in the midst of his disciples? A bin field there was he durst not cross, sooner than trample on it. He endured to be slain at the crossroads by the men of Acragas. He flourished in the 60th Olympiad and his school lasted until the 9th or 10th generation. 46. For the last of the Pythagoreans, whom Aristoxenus in his time saw, were Xenophilus from the Thracian Chalcidas, Phanton of Phlius, and Echcrates, Diocles and Polymastus, also of Phlius, who were pupils of Philolaus and Eurytus of Tarentum. There were 4 men of the name of Pythagoras living about the same time and at no great distance from one another: 1, of Croton, a man with tyrannical leanings; 2, of Phlius, an athlete, some say a trainer; 3, of Zacynthus; 4, our subject, who discovered the secrets of philosophy, and to whom was applied the phrase, "The master said, ipse dixit," which passed into a proverb of ordinary life. 47. Some say there was also another Pythagoras, a sculptor of Rhegium, who is thought to have been the first to aim at rhythm and symmetry, another a sculptor of Samos, another a bad orator, another a doctor who wrote on hernia and also compiled some things about Homer, and yet another who, so we are told by Dionysius, wrote a history of the Dorian race. Eratosthenes says, according to what we learn from Favorinus in the 8th book of his miscellaneous history, that the last named was the first to box scientifically, in the 48th Olympiad, keeping his hair long and wearing a purple robe, and that when he was excluded with ridicule from the boys' contest, he went at once to the men's and won that. 48. This is declared by Theaetetus's epigram, Nost one Pythagoras, long-haired Pythagoras, the far-famed boxer of the Samians? I am Pythagoras, ask the Eleans what were my feats, thou'lt not believe the tale. Favorinus says that our philosopher used definitions throughout the subject matter of mathematics, their use was extended by Socrates and his disciples, and afterwards by Aristotle and the Stoics. Further, we are told that he was the first to call the heaven the universe and the earth spherical, though Theophrastus says it was Parmenides, and Zeno that it was Hesiod. 49. It is said that Cylon was a rival of Pythagoras, as Antilochus was of Socrates. Pythagoras the athlete was also the subject of another epigram as follows: Gone to box with other lads is the lad Pythagoras, gone to the games Olympian Crates' son the Samian. The philosopher also wrote the following letter, Pythagoras to Anaximenes. Even you, O most excellent of men, were you no better born and famed than Pythagoras, would have risen and departed from Meltis. But now your ancestral glory has detained you as it had detained me were I Anaximenes' peer. But if you, the best men, abandon your cities, then will their good order perish, and the peril from the Medes will increase. 50. For always to scan the heavens is not well, but more seemly is it to be provident for one's mother country. For I too am not altogether in my discourses but am found no less in the wars which the Italians wage with one another. Having now finished our account of Pythagoras, we have next to speak of the noteworthy Pythagoreans. After them will come the philosophers whom some denominate sporadic, that is belonging to no particular school, and then, in the next place, we will append the succession of all those worthy of notice as far as Epicurus, in the way that we promised. We have already treated of Zeno and Laertius, so now we have first to speak of Empedocles, for some say he was a pupil of Pythagoras. Empedocles. 51. Empedocles was, according to Hippolytus, the son of Meton and grandson of Empedocles, and was a native of Agrigentum. This is confirmed by Timaeus in the 15th book of his Histories, and he adds that Empedocles, the poet's grandfather, had been a man of distinction. Hermippus also agrees with Timaeus. So, too, Heraclides, in his treatise on diseases, says that he was of an illustrious family, his grandfather having kept racehorses. Eratosthenes also in his Olympic victories records, on the authority of Aristotle, that the father of Meton was a victor in the 71st Olympiad. 52. The grammarian Apollodorus in his chronology tells us that he was the son of Meton, and Glaucus says he went to Thurii, just then founded. Then farther on he adds, those who relate that, being exiled from his home, he went to Syracuse and fought in their ranks against the Athenians seem, in my judgment at least, to be completely mistaken. For by that time either he was no longer living or in extreme old age, which is inconsistent with the story. For Aristotle and Heraclides both affirm that he died at the age of 60. The victor with the riding horse in the 71st Olympiad was this man's namesake and grandfather, so that Apollodorus in one and the same passage indicates the date as well as the fact. 53. But Citrus in his Lives states that Empedocles was the son of Xanaetus and himself left a son named Xanaetus, and that in the same Olympiad Empedocles himself was victorious in the horse race and his son in wrestling, or, as Heraclides in his Epitome has it, in the foot race. I found in the memorabilia of Favorinus a statement that Empedocles feasted the sacred envoys on a sacrificial ox made of honey and barley meal, and that he had a brother named Callicratides. Laertius, the son of Pythagoras, in his letter to Philolaus calls Empedocles the son of Archinimus. 54. That he belonged to Agrigentum in Sicily he himself testifies at the beginning of his purifications, my friends, who dwell in the great city sloping down to yellow Acrigas, hard by the citadel. So much for his family. Timaeus in the 9th book of his History says he was a pupil of Pythagoras, adding that, having been convicted at that time of stealing his discourses, he was, like Plato, excluded from taking part in the discussions of the school, and further, that Empedocles himself mentions Pythagoras in the lines, and there lived among them a man of superhuman knowledge, who verily possessed the greatest wealth of wisdom. Others say that it is to Parmenides that he is here referring. 55. Nenthus states that down to the time of Philolaus and Empedocles all Pythagoreans were admitted to the discussions. But when Empedocles himself made them public property by his poem, they made a law that they should not be imparted to any poet. He says the same thing also happened to Plato, for he too was excommunicated. But which of the Pythagoreans it was who had Empedocles for a pupil he did not say. For the epistle commonly attributed to Laertius and the statement that Empedocles was the pupil of both Hippasus and Brontinus he held to be unworthy of credence. Theophrastus affirms that he was an admirer of Parmenides and imitated him in his verses, for Parmenides too had published his treatise on nature in verse. 56. But Hermippus's account is that he was an admirer not so much of Parmenides as of Xenophanes, with whom in fact he lived and whose writing of poetry he imitated, and that his meeting with the Pythagoreans was subsequent. Alcidamas tells us in his treatise on physics that Zeno and Empedocles were pupils of Parmenides about the same time, that afterwards they left him, and that, while Zeno framed his own system, Empedocles became the pupil of Anaxagoras and Pythagoras, emulating the latter in dignity of life and bearing, and the former in his physical investigations. 57. Aristotle in his Sophist calls Empedocles the inventor of rhetoric as Zeno of dialectic. In his treatise on poets he says that Empedocles was of Homer's school and powerful in diction, being great in metaphors and in the use of all other poetical devices. He also says that he wrote other poems, in particular the invasion of Xerxes and a hymn to Apollo, which a sister of his, or, according to Hieronymus, his daughter, afterwards burnt. The hymn she destroyed unintentionally, but the poem on the Persian War deliberately, because it was unfinished. 58. And in general terms he says he wrote both tragedies and political discourses. But Heraclides, the son of Serapion, attributes the tragedies to a different author. Hieronymus declares that he had come across 43 of these plays, while Nenthus tells us that Empedocles wrote these tragedies in his youth, and that he, Nenthus, was acquainted with 7 of them. Citrus in his Lives says that he was also a physician and an excellent orator, at all events Gorgias of Leontini, a man preeminent in oratory and the author of a treatise on the art, had been his pupil. Of Gorgias Apollodorus says in his chronology that he lived to be 109. 59. Citrus quotes this same Gorgias as saying that he himself was present when Empedocles performed magical feats. Nay more, he contends that Empedocles in his poems lays claim to this power and to much besides when he says, "And thou shalt learn all the drugs that are a defense to ward off ills and old age, since for thee alone shall I accomplish all this. Thou shalt arrest the violence of the unwearied winds that arise and sweep the earth, laying waste the cornfields with their blasts, and again, if thou so will, thou shalt call back winds in requital. Thou shalt make after the dark rain a seasonable drought for men, and again after the summer drought thou shalt cause tree-nourishing streams to pour from the sky. Thou shalt bring back from Hades dead man's strength." 60. Tinuus also in the 18th book of his Histories remarks that Empedocles has been admired on many grounds. For instance, when the Etesian winds once began to blow violently and to damage the crops, he ordered asses to be flayed and bags to be made of their skin. These he stretched out here and there on the hills and headlands to catch the wind and, because this checked the wind, he was called the windstayer. Heraclides in his book on diseases says that he furnished paws in ears with the facts about the woman in a trance. This paws in ears, according to Aristippus and Citrus, was his bosom friend, to whom he dedicated his poem on nature thus, 61. Give ear, paws in ears, thou son of Anchitus the wise. Moreover he wrote an epigram upon him, the physician paws in ears, rightly so named, son of Anchitus, descendant of Asclepius, was born and bred at Gela. Many a white pining in fell torments did he bring back from Persephone's inmost shrine. At all events Heraclides testifies that the case of the woman in a trance was such that for 30 days he kept her body without pulsation though she never breathed, and for that reason Heraclides called him not merely a physician but a diviner as well, deriving the titles from the following lines also, 62. My friends, who dwell in the great city sloping down to yellow Acrigas, hard by the citadel, busied with goodly works, all hail. I go about among you an immortal god, no more immortal, so honored of all, as is meet, crowned with fillets and flowery garlands. Straightway as soon as I enter with these, men and women, into flourishing towns, I am reverenced and tens of thousands follow, to learn where is the path which leads to welfare, some desirous of oracles, others suffering from all kinds of diseases, desiring to hear a message of healing. 63. Tinuus explains that he called Agrigentum great, inasmuch as it had 800,000 inhabitants. Hence Empedocles, he continues, speaking of their luxury, said, the Agrigentines live delicately as if tomorrow they would die, but they build their houses well as if they thought they would live forever. It is said that Cleomenes the rhapsode recited this very poem, The Purifications, at Olympia, so Favorinus in his Memorabilia. Aristotle too declares him to have been a champion of freedom and averse to rule of every kind, seeing that, as Xanthus relates in his account of him, he declined the kingship when it was offered to him, obviously because he preferred a frugal life. 64. With this Timaeus agrees, at the same time giving the reason why Empedocles favored democracy, namely, that, having been invited to dine with one of the magistrates, when the dinner had gone on some time and no wine was put on the table, though the other guests kept quiet, he, becoming indignant, ordered wine to be brought. Then the host confessed that he was waiting for the servant of the Senate to appear. When he came he was made master of the revels, clearly by the arrangement of the host, whose design of making himself tyrant was but thinly veiled, for he ordered the guests either to drink wine or have it poured over their heads. For the time being Empedocles was reduced to silence. The next day he impeached both of them, the host and the master of the revels, and secured their condemnation and execution. This, then, was the beginning of his political career. 65. Again, when Acron the physician asked the council for a site on which to build a monument to his father, who had been eminent among physicians, Empedocles came forward and forbade it in a speech where he enlarged upon equality and in particular put the following question: "But what inscription shall we put upon it? Shall it be this? Acron the eminent physician of Agrigentum, son of Acros, is buried beneath the steep eminence of his most eminent native city." Others give as the second line, "is laid in an exalted tomb on a most exalted peak." Some attribute this couplet to Simonides. 66. Subsequently Empedocles broke up the assembly of the 1,003 years after it had been set up, which proves not only that he was wealthy but that he favored the popular cause. At all events Timaeus in his 11th and 12th books, for he mentions him more than once, states that he seems to have held opposite views when in public life and when writing poetry. In some passages one may see that he is boastful and selfish. At any rate these are his words: "All hail! I go about among you an immortal god, no more immortal," etc. At the time when he visited Olympia he demanded an excessive deference, so that never was anyone so talked about in gatherings of friends as Empedocles. 67. Subsequently, however, when Agrigentum came to regret him, the descendants of his personal enemies opposed his return home, and this was why he went to Peloponnesus, where he died. Nor did Timon let even him alone, but fastens upon him in these words: Empedocles, too, mouthing tawdry verses, to all that had independent force, he gave a separate existence, and the principles he chose need others to explain them. As to his death different accounts are given. Thus Heraclides, after telling the story of the woman in a trance, how that Empedocles became famous because he had sent away the dead woman alive, goes on to say that he was offering a sacrifice close to the field of Pasianax. Some of his friends had been invited to the sacrifice, including Pausanias. 68. Then, after the feast, the remainder of the company dispersed and retired to rest, some under the trees in the adjoining field, others wherever they chose, while Empedocles himself remained on the spot where he had reclined at table. At daybreak all got up, and he was the only one missing. A search was made, and they questioned the servants, who said they did not know where he was. Thereupon someone said that in the middle of the night he heard an exceedingly loud voice calling Empedocles. Then he got up and beheld a light in the heavens and a glitter of lamps, but nothing else. His hearers were amazed at what had occurred, and Pausanias came down and sent people to search for him. But later he bade them take no further trouble, for things beyond expectation had happened to him, and it was their duty to sacrifice to him since he was now a god. 69. Hermippus tells us that Empedocles cured Panthea, a woman of Agrigentum, who had been given up by the physicians, and this was why he was offering sacrifice, and that those invited were about 80 in number. Hippobatus, again, asserts that, when he got up, he set out on his way to Etna. Then, when he had reached it, he plunged into the fiery craters and disappeared, his intention being to confirm the report that he had become a god. Afterwards the truth was known, because one of his slippers was thrown up in the flames. It had been his custom to wear slippers of bronze. To this story Pausanias is made, by Heraclides, to take exception. 70. Diodorus of Ephesus, when writing of Anaximander, declares that Empedocles emulated him, displaying theatrical arrogance and wearing stately robes. We are told that the people of Selinus suffered from pestilence owing to the noisome smells from the river hard by, so that the citizens themselves perished and their women died in childbirth, that Empedocles conceived the plan of bringing 2 neighboring rivers to the place at his own expense, and that by this admixture he sweetened the waters. When in this way the pestilence had been stayed and the Selinuntines were feasting on the river bank, Empedocles appeared, and the company rose up and worshipped and prayed to him as to a god. It was then to confirm this belief of theirs that he leapt into the fire. 71. These stories are contradicted by Timaeus, who expressly says that he left Sicily for Peloponnesus and never returned at all, and this is the reason Timaeus gives for the fact that the manner of his death is unknown. He replies to Heraclides, whom he mentions by name, in his 14th book. Pythagoreans, he says, was a citizen of Syracuse and possessed no land at Agrigentum. Further, if such a story had been in circulation, Pausanias would have set up a monument to his friend, as to a god, in the form of a statue or shrine, for he was a wealthy man. How came he, adds Timaeus, to leap into the craters, which he had never once mentioned though they were not far off? 72. He must then have died in Peloponnesus. It is not at all surprising that his tomb is not found, the same is true of many other men. After urging some such arguments Timaeus goes on to say, but Heraclides is everywhere just such a collector of absurdities, telling us, for instance, that a man dropped down to earth from the moon. Hippolytus assures us that formerly there was in Agrigentum a statue of Empedocles with his head covered, and afterwards another with the head uncovered in front of the Senate house at Rome, which plainly the Romans had removed to that site. For portrait statues with inscriptions are extant even now. Nenthus of Cyzicus, who tells about the Pythagoreans, relates that, after the death of Meton, the germs of a tyranny began to show themselves, that then it was Empedocles who persuaded the Agrigentines to put an end to their factions and cultivate equality in politics. 73. Moreover, from his abundant means he bestowed dowries upon many of the maidens of the city who had no dowry. No doubt it was the same means that enabled him to don a purple robe and over it a golden girdle, as Favorinus relates in his Memorabilia, and again slippers of bronze and a Delphic laurel wreath. He had thick hair, and a train of boy attendants. He himself was always grave, and kept this gravity of demeanor unshaken. In such sort would he appear in public, when the citizens met him, they recognized in this demeanor the stamp, as it were, of royalty. But afterwards, as he was going in a carriage to Messene to attend some festival, he fell and broke his thigh. This brought an illness which caused his death at the age of 77. Moreover, his tomb is in Megara. 74. As to his age, Aristotle's account is different, for he makes him to have been 60 when he died, while others make him 109. He flourished in the 84th Olympiad. Demetrius of Troezen in his pamphlet against the Sophists said of him, adapting the words of Homer, he tied a noose that hung aloft from a tall cornel tree and thrust his neck into it, and his soul went down to Hades. In the short letter of Telauges which was mentioned above it is stated that by reason of his age he slipped into the sea and was drowned. Thus and thus much of his death. There is an epigram of my own on him in my pamphlet in a satirical vein, as follows, 75. Thou, Empedocles, didst cleanse thy body with nimble flame, fire didst thou drink from everlasting bowls. I will not say that of thine own will thou didst hurl thyself into the stream of Etna, thou didst fall in against thy will when thou wouldst fain not have been found out. And another, verily there is a tale about the death of Empedocles, how that once he fell from a carriage and broke his right thigh. But if he leapt into the bowls of fire and so took a draught of life, how was it that his tomb was shown still in Megara? 76. His doctrines were as follows, that there are 4 elements, fire, water, earth and air, besides friendship by which these are united, and strife by which they are separated. These are his words, shining Zeus and life-bringing Hera, Idoneus and Nestis, who lets flow from her tears the source of mortal life, where by Zeus he means fire, by Hera earth, by Idoneus air, and by Nestis water. And their continuous change, he says, never ceases, as if this ordering of things were eternal. At all events he goes on, at one time all things uniting in one through love, at another each carried in a different direction through the hatred born of strife. 77. The sun he calls a vast collection of fire and larger than the moon. The moon, he says, is of the shape of a quoit, and the heaven itself crystalline. The soul, again, assumes all the various forms of animals and plants. At any rate, he says, before now I was born a boy and a maid, a bush and a bird, and a dumb fish leaping out of the sea. His poems on nature and purifications run to 5,000 lines, his discourse on medicine to 600. Of the tragedies we have spoken above. Epicharmus. 78. Epicharmus of Kos, son of Helothales, was another pupil of Pythagoras. When 3 months old he was sent to Megara in Sicily and thence to Syracuse, as he tells us in his own writings. On his statue this epigram is written, if the great sun outshines the other stars, if the great sea is mightier than the streams, so Epicharmus wisdom all excelled, whom Syracuse his fatherland thus crowned. He has left memoirs containing his physical, ethical and medical doctrines, and he has made marginal notes in most of the memoirs, which clearly show that they were written by him. He died at the age of 90. Archytas. 79. Archytas of Tarentum, son of Nisagoras, or, if we may believe Aristoxenus, of Hestiaeus, was another of the Pythagoreans. He it was whose letter saved Plato when he was about to be put to death by Dionysius. He was generally admired for his excellence in all fields, thus he was generalissimo of his city 7 times, while the law excluded all others even from a 2nd year of command. We have 2 letters written to him by Plato, he having first written to Plato in these terms, Archytas wishes Plato good health. 80. You have done well to get rid of your ailment, as we learned both from your own message and through Lamiscus that you have. We attended to the matter of the memoirs and went up to Lucania where we found the true progeny of Ocellus, to wit, his writings. We did get the works on law, on kingship, of piety, and on the origin of the universe, all of which we have sent on to you, but the rest are, at present, nowhere to be found. If they should turn up, you shall have them. This is Archytas's letter, and Plato's answer is as follows. Plato to Archytas greeting. 81. I was overjoyed to get the memoirs which you sent, and I am very greatly pleased with the writer of them. He seems to be a right worthy descendant of his distant forebears. They came, so it is said, from Myra, and were among those who emigrated from Troy in Laomedon's time, really good men, as the traditional story shows. Those memoirs of mine about which you wrote are not yet in a fit state, but such as they are I have sent them on to you. We both agree about their custody, so I need not give any advice on that head. Farewell. These then are the letters which passed between them. 82. 4 men have borne the name of Archytas, 1, our subject, 2, a musician, of Mytilene, 3, the compiler of a work on agriculture, 4, a writer of epigrams. Some speak of a 5th, an architect, to whom is attributed a book on mechanism which begins like this. These things I learned from Chaucer of Carthage. A tale is told of the musician that, When it was cast in his teeth that he could not be heard, he replied, "Well, my instrument shall speak for me and win the day." Aristoxenus says that our Pythagorean was never defeated during his whole generalship, though he once resigned it owing to bad feeling against him, whereupon the army at once fell into the hands of the enemy. 83. He was the first to bring mechanics to a system by applying mathematical principles. He also first employed mechanical motion in a geometrical construction, namely, when he tried, by means of a section of a half-cylinder, to find two mean proportionals in order to duplicate the cube. In geometry, too, he was the first to discover the cube, as Plato says in the Republic. Alcmaeon. Alcmaeon of Croton, another disciple of Pythagoras, wrote chiefly on medicine, but now and again he touches on natural philosophy, as when he says, "Most human affairs go in pairs." He is thought to have been the first to compile a physical treatise, so we learn from Favorinus in his miscellaneous history, and he said that the moon, and, generally, the heavenly bodies, are in their nature eternal. He was the son of Peritas, as he himself tells us at the beginning of his treatise. These are the words of Alcmaeon of Croton, son of Peritas, which he spake to Brontinus, Leon and Batulus, of things invisible, as of mortal things, only the gods have certain knowledge, but to us, as men, only inference from evidence is possible, and so on. He held also that the soul is immortal and that it is continuously in motion like the sun. Hippasus. 84. Hippasus of Metapontum was another Pythagorean, who held that there is a definite time which the changes in the universe take to complete and that the all is limited and ever in motion. According to Demetrius in his work on men of the same name, he left nothing in writing. There were two men named Hippasus, one being our subject, and the other a man who wrote the Laconian Constitution in 5 books, and he himself was a Lacedaemonian. Philolaus. Philolaus of Croton was a Pythagorean, and it was from him that Plato requests Dion to buy the Pythagorean treatises. He, Dion, was put to death because he was thought to be aiming at a tyranny. This is what we have written upon him: fancies of all things are most flattering, if you intend, but do not, you are lost. So Croton taught Philolaus to his cost, who fancied he would like to be their king. 85. His doctrine is that all things are brought about by necessity and in harmonious interrelation. He was the first to declare that the earth moves in a circle, though some say that it was Hicetas of Syracuse. He wrote one book, and it was this work which, according to Hermippus, some writer said that Plato the philosopher, when he went to Sicily to Dionysius's court, bought from Philolaus's relatives for the sum of 40 Alexandrine minas of silver, from which also the Timaeus was transcribed. Others say that Plato received it as a present for having procured from Dionysius the release of a young disciple of Philolaus who had been cast into prison. According to Demetrius in his work on men of the same name, Philolaus was the first to publish the Pythagorean treatises, to which he gave the title On Nature, beginning as follows: Nature in the ordered universe was composed of unlimited and limiting elements, and so was the whole universe and all that is therein. Eudoxus. 86. Eudoxus of Cnidos, the son of Aeschines, was an astronomer, a geometer, a physician and a legislator. He learned geometry from Archytas and medicine from Philistion the Sicilian, as Climacus tells us in his tables. Sotion in his Successions of Philosophers says that he was also a pupil of Plato. When he was about 23 years old and in straitened circumstances, he was attracted by the reputation of the Socratics and set sail for Athens with Theomedon the physician, who provided for his wants. Some even say that he was Theomedon's favorite. Having disembarked at Piraeus, he went up every day to Athens and, when he had attended the sophists' lectures, returned again to the port. 87. After spending 2 months there, he went home and, aided by the liberality of his friends, he proceeded to Egypt with Chrysippus the physician, bearing with him letters of introduction from Agesilaus to Necton Abbes, who recommended him to the priests. There he remained 1 year and 4 months with his beard and eyebrows shaved, and there, some say, he wrote his Octatorus. From there he went to Cyzicus and the Propontis, giving lectures. Afterwards he came to the court of Mausolus. Then at length he returned to Athens, bringing with him a great number of pupils. According to some, this was for the purpose of annoying Plato, who had originally passed him over. 88. Some say that, when Plato gave a banquet, Eudoxus, owing to the numbers present, introduced the fashion of arranging couches in a semicircle. Nicomachus, the son of Aristotle, states that he declared pleasure to be the good. He was received in his native city with great honor, proof of this being the decree concerning him. But he also became famous throughout Greece, as legislator for his fellow citizens, so we learn from Hermippus in his 4th book on the 7 sages, and as the author of astronomical and geometrical treatises and other important works. He had 3 daughters, Actis, Philtis and Delphis. 89. Eratosthenes in his writings addressed to Baton tells us that he also composed dialogues of dogs. Others say that they were written by Egyptians in their own language and that he translated them and published them in Greece. Chrysippus of Cnidos, the son of Arrhenius, attended his lectures on the gods, the world, and the phenomena of the heavens, while in medicine he was the pupil of Philistion the Sicilian. Eudoxus also left some excellent commentaries. He had a son Aristogoras, who had a son Chrysippus, the pupil of Athlius. To this Chrysippus we owe a medical work on the treatment of the eye, speculations upon nature having occupied his mind. 90. 3 men have borne the name of Eudoxus: 1, our present subject; 2, a historian, of Rhodes; 3, a Sicilian Greek, the son of Agathocles, a comic poet, who 3 times won the prize in the city Dionysia and 5 times at the Lenia, so we are told by Apollodorus in his chronology. We also find another physician of Cnidos mentioned by Eudoxus in his geography as advising people to be always exercising their limbs by every form of gymnastics, and their sense organs in the same way. The same authority, Apollodorus, states that Eudoxus of Cnidos flourished about the 103rd Olympiad, and that he discovered the properties of curves. He died in his 53rd year. When he was in Egypt with Chonuphes of Heliopolis, the sacred bull Apis licked his cloak. From this the priests foretold that he would be famous but short-lived, so we are informed by Pythagoreans in his Memorabilia. 91. There is a poem of our own upon him, which runs thus: it is said that at Memphis Eudoxus learned his coming fate from the bull with beautiful horns. No words did it utter, for whence comes speech to a bull? Nature did not provide the young bull Apis with a chattering tongue. But, standing sideways by him, it licked his robe, by which it plainly prophesied, "You shall soon die." Whereupon, soon after, this fate overtook him, when he had seen 53 risings of the Pleiades. Eudoxus used to be called Indexos, illustrious, instead of Eudoxus by reason of his brilliant reputation. Having now dealt with the famous Pythagoreans, let us next discuss the so-called sporadic philosophers. And first we must speak of Heraclitus.